Welcome back to the Everything is Black and White podcast. It's time for the Monday show. I'm Andrew Musgrove and I'm joined by Sean McCormick, and we're here to reflect on Newcastle United's 2-0 defeat to Aston Villa up at St James's Park. Goals from Buendia and what concealed the points for the visitors. Newcastle had a couple of clear chances, but other than that, offered very, very little. Sean, welcome back to the show. Hope you're well. Just some of your thoughts on what you saw on Sunday before we talk a little bit more in depth about it.
Yeah, obviously at the game yesterday in the press box, and I don't know about everyone else, but even though the performance wasn't necessarily the worst performance of the season by any stretch, I almost come away from the game feeling as deflated as I've felt of any other defeat this season. Now, people might think that's a bit dramatic, but I just think more the context of the game, and Newcastle and Aston Villa are sort of the two teams sort of pitted against each other and grouped against each other as the teams that are sort of trying to break that big six stranglehold in the Premier League. And I think at home, particularly in recent years, Newcastle had a fantastic record against Aston Villa. Now, obviously, that doesn't really necessarily mean anything for this season, but I went into the game thinking that Newcastle could win, should win, and obviously that's never a given. It's never a God-given right to beat a team of Aston Villa's quality in the Premier League. And in fact, any game in the Premier League really is not a God-given right to win at St James's Park. But I just think that going into the game, I fancy Newcastle to get something. It didn't pan out that way. Obviously, if Sandro Tonali scores that chance inside the first 40 seconds of the game, that totally changes the complexion of the game. But then the way that the game sort of then settled into its rhythm, I just thought Aston Villa were the better team throughout the game. I thought Newcastle was second best in every department. I thought the fact that they obviously missed Bruno Guimaraes, but Aston Villa, were just much more fluid in the way they played. I thought they looked more dangerous. They had more energy about them. And I think at St James's Park, there's probably been a bit of match fatigue. There's been a lot of matches at home recently, and it's a byproduct of Newcastle playing in all four competitions and going far in the Carabao Cup that they've had so many games in such quick succession. I think it's catching up with everyone, not just the players. I think that inside St James's Park yesterday, I think you felt that with the atmosphere. The whole thing just felt a bit flat. The players, the performance, everything about it, and Villa deserved the win. Obviously, there are moments in the game where Newcastle had chances, of course. You know, Emi Martinez made that save of Tonali I've just mentioned. He made a fantastic save of Lewis Melody as well, and Anthony Gordon misses that chance in the second half where Trippier fires the ball across the face of goal. That's a big chance as well. So they've had three big chances. Whether they take any of those, obviously the game looks a lot different, and obviously the way we're talking about it and the way that Eddie Howe assesses the game is a lot different. But I don't know about everyone else. I just felt flat, deflated. That's probably the best two words I can use to describe coming out of the stadium. Just because, as I've said there, Newcastle and Villa are supposed to be the sort of on a very even keel, and I just thought that Villa looked streets ahead of Newcastle yesterday, and it was a bit of a sobering reality, I think, of where this season's going. It can still be salvaged, of course, because everything's so tight, and if they go to Liverpool at the weekend and get something, then all of a sudden things look a bit rosier again, and it's definitely a case of the top three are sort of cast away, and it's a battle between the rest of the teams to get those European spots, and Newcastle by no means out of that discussion at all. But yeah, I just thought it was a bit of a sobering one, and one that I think everyone came away from deflated, flat, beaten up a bit, I guess, of sort of the reality of the two teams and where they're currently on and the trajectories that both teams are on.
Yeah, it felt middle of the road. That's the words I used when I texted you last night. It just felt a bit meh. I think it was clear that, as teams have done previously, Sean, Aston Villa came to sit deep to absorb what pressure Newcastle had. I mean, in reality, Newcastle really didn't put them under too much pressure. They'd get the ball, they'd break, move with pace, and Newcastle couldn't deal with that. Yes, as we mentioned, they were doing it without Bruno, but I'm not entirely sure him being in that start 11 would have impacted the end result. I still think Newcastle would have struggled to break Villa down, who just executed their game plan perfectly. And I think the key question to answer how we should reflect on this result is, where are Newcastle United and Aston Villa in terms of realistic ambition? Are they on the same level? Because if the answer is no, then Newcastle United have been defeated, yes, at home, but by a side challenging for the Premier League title with a world-class manager in charge? If the answer is yes, then Newcastle have just been outplayed with relative ease by a club that we say they should be on par with and battling for the same goals. And that is slightly concerning. So if you guys watching and listening want to answer that question, let us know in the comments. I'm intrigued to get Sean's answer on it as well. Do you think Newcastle United and Aston Villa, everybody fit, everyone raring to go, are the clubs looking to achieve the same thing?
I would say yes, and I would probably quantify that with the fact that Aston Villa are definitely overperforming in terms of where their means are and where their squad is. I think if you look at wage spend and stuff like that, obviously it came out this week that Newcastle have got the 8th highest wage spend in the league. So if you just go off that metric, and obviously there's a lot of different things to consider there, but if you go that metric, Newcastle should be looking to finish top 8, and they probably will do that this season. But then I think Villa are wrong about that level as well, and I think they're overperforming this season. If you think back to the start of the season, the two teams obviously played each other in the first game of the season at Villa Park. Newcastle dominated that game, didn't win it, but probably should have done it on the day they had the chances to do so. And I don't think anyone looked at Villa that day and thought they're going to be in a sort of outside conversation for title contenders. I don't think they actually are, but they're comfortably top 3 at the minute, and you'd fancy them to go on now and qualify for the Champions League next season. There's probably also an argument that it's sort of cyclical in its nature, and the fact if you looked at, obviously Newcastle finished 4th place in 2023, then finished 7th when they kind of struggled with the extra demands of European football. Aston Villa then finished 4th that season, finished in the top 4. They then finished 6th last season. Newcastle got back to the Champions League, and it's sort of kind of twisting back around again. I think people obviously then quantify that and sort of hit back at me by saying that Villa are in Europe this season, so it's not quite the same, which I totally accept. And I think obviously the counter argument to that is the Europa League isn't anywhere near as taxing as the Champions League. Villa are 2nd in the Europa League, I think, just on the top of my head. They've lost 1 game and won the other 6, so they're comfortably going through in that competition. They can afford to rest players on Thursday, whereas obviously Newcastle trying to break into the top 8 against PSG definitely can't afford to rest players again in Paris on Wednesday. So that's a sort of difference as well. And it's a hard one to answer. I think in terms of ambition, they're at exactly the same level. And obviously this season, Villa are doing a lot better job of it domestically in the league than Newcastle are. I think, talking to Villa reporters in the build-up to this game for a couple of pieces that I did, the one thing that they haven't got, which Newcastle have got, is that trophy. And they're sort of on similar journeys where you look at the success of Eddie Howe and the success of Unai Emery, and both clubs punching above their weight and both clubs sort of disrupting the big 6 and disrupting those Champions League places. But Villa haven't managed to do it in the Cups as of yet. They lost in the semi-finals of the FA Cup last season to Crystal Palace, which was obviously a huge blow for them because they would have expected to win that game and go through the final against Manchester City. And they haven't quite got that sort of rubber stamped, we've got something tangible here to show for it during Unai Emery's tenure, which obviously Newcastle have with Eddie Howe. But certainly domestically this season, they're doing a much better job of it. And I think, if you're going off sort of recency bias and what you've seen in the last couple of years, probably Unai Emery is that sort of step ahead just of Eddie Howe. That's not me saying that, Eddie Howe isn't doing a fantastic job at Newcastle, and I don't think there's been obviously quite a bit of talk this season about replacing Howe and where Newcastle would go without Howe. I still don't think right now Newcastle have anyone better that they could possibly attract than Howe. There may be people who disagree with that in the comments, and obviously everyone's entitled to their opinion there, but I still think Howe's doing a fantastic job, and there's been criticism this season that's been more than warranted of some of the performances, and I think we'll get on to some of that later in the episode. But I still think that this season is a bit of a transitional one for Newcastle. They've sort of always had Alexander Isak's goals to sort of build the team around and build the patterns of play around, and it hasn't quite happened for either striker yet, that they haven't really sort of taken that mantle on, and Newcastle haven't really been able to play in the same way, and it's definitely affected the sort of numbers in terms of assists of the wingers this season, 100%, that the strikers haven't quite got to grips with the way that Newcastle play yet. Johan Visser probably isn't fully fit yet. He didn't have the biggest of pre-seasons. He didn't have the game time since joining the club that he would have wanted. Obviously, he had that big injury and he come back in December. There's signs that he can score goals and he may come good, but at the minute it just isn't quite quick in there. And obviously Nick Voltemada, fantastic player, started off like a house on fire, then has sort of plateaued, which you can half expect for a young striker in his first season in the Premier League. And there's criticism of the way that he plays and not being that sort of out and out number 9 that Newcastle need, and they're going to have to get around that and find ways of playing with both of those players. I think it was interesting yesterday, Andrew, the way that Villa got bodies around Ollie Watkins was very different the way Newcastle played. They were very fluid in terms of the way they set up. If you looked at the 3 players they had behind Watkins, it was obviously Sancho, who sort of held his width and stuck to his task on the right hand side. But then Emi Buendia and Morgan Rogers, it was very fluid of where they were actually playing, and actually some of the positions that Buendia was picking up between the back 4 and the midfield 3, I don't think Newcastle quite got to grips with, and it reminded us a bit of the Barcelona game where Pedri and Frankie de Jong were absolutely fantastic as sort of the 2 double pivots in the midfield, but then you had Fermin Lopez picking up those positions where Newcastle didn't really deal with it that day either. And there's an argument that if Bruno was on the pitch, he may have sort of snaffled that out. And I think, they didn't pick up the warning signs, because Buendia had a very similar attempt, which Nick Pope saved from distance, where he picked up that pocket of space before the goal, and they didn't heed that warning. Obviously, he then scored a goal from similar range, fantastic goal, nothing Nick Pope could have done about it. But I do think if Newcastle sort of adapted to it and heeded the warning, they may have been able to sort of cut that one out. So I've run a few tangents there, but I think in answer to the question, Newcastle and Villa are on similar paths, and I think that's why I was so deflated yesterday. That I think that certainly this season Villa have just adapted and kicked on to a new level, whereas Newcastle haven't quite got to grips with losing Isak and haven't quite got to grips with the new signings. And when you're in the position that Newcastle and Villa are, where you have the obvious sort of PSR constraints to really kick on and compete financially with the big 6, you can't really miss with your recruitment. And I think it's too early to say Newcastle have missed with the recruitment, but it's very obvious to say that only one of the 6 signings has been absolutely fantastic consistently this season. Nick Voltemada's had his moments, but then Visser hasn't been fit. Jacob Ramsey hasn't caught fire yet, and Anthony Elanga has been nowhere near a £55 million winger. And Aaron Ramsdale's obviously the other one on loan in goal. But yeah, a lot of problems that I've sort of glossed over there, and I think that's the story of Newcastle's season. That there's a lot of transition. There's a lot of it's a bit of a bridge season for them, and actually the fact they're doing well in the cups, and if they do finish in the European places, that probably is about where they're at the minute. And the proof and the sort of the test will be how they then kick on in the summer and sort of try and evolve again and become a bit more creative. Because I think that was the difference of Villa yesterday. They were fresh, they had more ideas, and Newcastle sort of doing the same things that they've done for a few years now, and it's gone a bit flat, it's gone a bit stale, and it's just not quite working in the final third.
Lots of key points there, I think, which are really important in terms of the analysis of the game. And you talk about how close some of the players were to Ollie Watkins, and I think that is something people are now asking of Newcastle United and the formation and the system, because we are seeing, whether it's Voldemort or Wissa, just they're totally isolated every time they go onto the pitch. Now, many people want to see that number 10, Voldemort, in that position, Wissa playing off, and we saw it in the FA Cup. I thought it had its moments. I don't think we will see it again, even though I feel like that could be the best option. The other option is to get the wingers closer to whoever is playing up top. That's something we've spoken about on this podcast for many weeks as well. But it all goes back to the original point. Whichever system change you think is the solution, the key point is that Eddie Howe is unlikely to make that change. And I think the key question is he potentially too stubborn? Is he right not to make the change because we understand it? Is that because there isn't too much time on the training pitch to allow him to work at it and to get it right, which is understandable. But you mentioned it there. The same things are getting done time and time again and aren't working offensively. So is it a case that you just continue to do it and maybe one every 7 games it works? Or do you just bite the bullet, make the change, and look, and if it goes wrong, you hold your hands up and say, I was reluctant to do so, but I think actually you might get a pat on the back for saying, and people going, actually, well, at least you tried something different. It didn't work, but at least you tried.
I understand those arguments, certainly, and as you said, he tried it against Bournemouth and it had its moments, and I thought Baltimore and Viz actually looked quite decent together, but then I think that Newcastle then sort of lacked the midfield control that they've perhaps had with the sort of flat three that they play. I think the problem is, if you look at the recruitment of Newcastle in the summer, they've recruited completely for a 4-3-3 team, and they've almost got sort of 2 11s and 2 players for each position, where it's like they've recruited completely flat formation. So when Howe came out yesterday and said that he understands the sort of point about a number 10 and having that sort of creative influence sort of playing in that pocket between the midfield and the defence, that he can't really change that until the summer, because yes, you made the point there, Andrew, the training time is just so limited, because if they get beat on Wednesday, which is a very realistic possibility, then February's 2 games a week again, as it has been in January, as it has been in December, and it's that relentless schedule is something that Newcastle want. But if you wanted to make drastic changes to system and identity in the way that Newcastle play, that has to come on the training ground. Now, I think the problem is that the recruitment in the summer, as I said there, they've done it for a 4-3-3 formation. They've then drilled it as a 4-3-3 formation in that training time that they've had. And I just don't think that the club anticipated the amount of teething problems that some of the players would have had. Now, this is a debate that's obviously been had a lot, because Newcastle and Eddie Howe have signed a lot of Premier League ready players. Now, the feeling is with those players is that they are the sort of plug-in and play options, and it hasn't quite happened for Anthony Elanga, and it hasn't quite happened for Jacob Ramsey. Now, that's a big issue, because then the whole point of having a squad of players who have 2 players each position is that you can rotate, and you can do that without really harming the team. But I wouldn't say that any Newcastle fan would turn around and say that by starting Anthony Elanga in a big game over Harvey Barnes or Anthony Gordon isn't harming the team right now, because his confidence isn't there and he hasn't shown the form that he showed at Nottingham Forest. So actually, it is a big risk to take a informing out of the team to put in Anthony Elanga. Same with Jacob Ramsey. Newcastle thought they were signing a sort of box-to-box goal-scoring midfielder, and he's got 0 goals and 0 assists. And actually, his strengths so far have been sort of controlling games and being good in possession and being good against the press. But actually, when he gets to the final third, he doesn't necessarily play the killer pass. He looks scared to pull the trigger to take a shot, to put a cross in, and that's obviously a confidence thing. So it comes back to the point where the pressure on recruitment for Newcastle is huge to get it right, because they've had 3 windows before this one in the summer they haven't been able to spend. They have to get it right this summer, and you can't guarantee that they're going to get it right straight away. That's not to write them off, and they could turn out to be fantastic players, but it just hasn't happened so far. So, yeah, I understand the argument for changes totally. And it's frustrating sometimes, where the Wolves game, for example, when we were there last weekend at Molineux, and I said to Lee Wright after that game, I was like, when we were driving home, I was like, we could still have been watching the game now 4 hours later when we're on the M62 back home, and I still don't think Newcastle would have scored in that game. And that's the issue and the frustration is the struggling to break down teams in that low block. And I don't think they have a sort of, to say they haven't got a plan B is probably a bit strong, but it is almost like they can't change the formation, and the players that they're bringing on aren't having the impact on the game that you would like to have to sort of freshen it up and change it. And I think if that starts to happen, there'll be less sort of talk for change and less sort of talk to see something different. But until that happens, they just got to swallow those arguments. And I think if they want to change the way they play, unfortunately, because of Newcastle's schedule, that's just going to have to come in the summer. The only thing they can do is sort of tweak personnel in the way that, obviously, last season when they made the change with where Bruno and where Sonali played in the midfield, that was sort of had a transformational effect on Newcastle's season without actually tweaking the system too much. It was just tweaking the personnel. Now, maybe that's where they find some sort of inspiration, but yeah, I think it's going to be a lot more frustration to come and a lot more sort of teething issues to come before it sort of clicks. When we're saying all of this, though, as well, Andrew, it's interesting, because if you actually look at the form table in the Premier League, I think because every team's sort of in a bit of a rut at the minute, Newcastle are still either top or second alongside Man United, which is just, it just doesn't feel that way when you're watching it. It's almost like the eye test never lies, but sometimes the stats do, if that makes any sense. Like, the stats are sort of saying one thing, but the eye's saying the other. So yeah, it's just a bit frustrating at the minute, and I think until we see some sort of positive, consistent change and some momentum in Newcastle season, we're going to keep having these conversations.
I think the issue is that if you are any Premier League manager coming to face Newcastle United, or if you're going to welcome them to your place, it doesn't matter how you play. I think what you see your style is, I think you adapt it and you just say, we're just going to sit back and let Newcastle United have the majority of the ball and invite them on, because we've seen it doesn't matter whether you're high fly in Aston Villa or down in the dumbest Wolves. If you sit back and you invite Newcastle on, they are unable to break you down. I think that's where the frustration really comes into it from some Newcastle United fans, is that they just can't break a low block side down. So why continue to play the same formation and try it week in, week out when it's just not working? I think that's where people are kind of pulling their hair out. And you mentioned there about the fact that the system used against Bournemouth in the FA Cup, it removed some of the control that we tend to see in the midfield. But I would argue that too many times this season, we've seen exactly the same kind of goals conceded that we did on Sunday against Villa, time and time again throughout the season, where the man is not being followed. And regular viewers and listeners to this podcast, you can tick the box which says Andrew's rant about the goals and Tonali not following his man, because it happened again for both goals here, where Buendia, his first touch on that passage of play is just inside Newcastle's own half, and then he's allowed to roam to the edge of the box to pick the ball up and fire in the back of the net. It is a great effort. Nick Pope can do nothing about it. But the fact he's been allowed to travel that distance with no one picking him up is so frustrating. And then the goal for Watkins, you not only had Watkins free in the box, you also had Konza coming in unmarked as well. You know, they've ran past Miley, they've ran past Barnes, Ramsey's not watching, Voldemort is not watching. It's criminal that this is happening and happening time and time again. It's my real frustration, because if you're going to stick with the formation, that's fair enough. I understand the reasons why and they're all valid. But you've got to make sure defensively that you're doing the basics right. And every single week, I seem to come on this podcast and have the same rant about the midfield and the defense and the gap between it, and how teams are just exploiting it. They're sitting back and absorbing. And then when they go forward, they can just roam it in that space and do as they please. And you're not going to win games like that if you're Newcastle United. They've got to be stronger. They've got to be more disciplined. And I'm sick of saying it, but it's every single week. And Eddie Howe must be so frustrated. The players have got to take responsibility, but collectively they've got to stop allowing. It's not even good teams, Sean. It's just teams that amount of space, because they're getting punished nearly every single game.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because he made the point before the Chelsea game back in December about Newcastle having the second best record defensively. Now that was clarified as what he meant is that in terms of expected goals against, now I'm sure there's a few people now shouting at the screen, expected goals is a load of rubbish, blah, blah, blah. But it is a good indicator of sort of performance trends, I think. If you look at like Aston Villa, for example, before the game yesterday, and I haven't checked the updated table, but if you go on the expected points that they should have had this season in terms of the expected goals in games, they should be 13th and not third. Sunderland are another example. They should be second bottom, whereas actually they're in the top half of the table. And Newcastle have sort of always been the outlier. So even when they were struggling in the bottom half of the table, they were always up there, like fourth or fifth in the table. I think they still are fifth or sixth, something like that. Now, what that indicates is that actually structurally that they're not too bad. They're set up well defensively, but then like the individual errors that they're making, or the long range goals that are going in, or goals that shouldn't be going in or going in, are obviously plentiful. Otherwise, they wouldn't be losing games, and they would be higher in the table. Now, also, if you take that to the other end, they're creating high quality chances in games that are just not taken. Even yesterday, again, the overall mood of the game was flat. It was disheartening because Villa were a better team, but actually, they've had three massive chances in that game. Tonali obviously almost scores in the first minute. Miley's header has a brilliant save from Martinez. Now, Anthony Gordon has that one where he just can't quite stretch fast enough and quick enough and long enough to get onto the end of Trippier's cross with a clean connection. But if they score two or three of those goals, they win the game. It's as simple as that. And I think that's been a thing far too many times, is that the creativity has been a problem. When they do create the chances, they just aren't clinical enough. And now that has never been I don't think that's ever been an issue for Newcastle in previous seasons. And again, you sort of hark back to the Isak transfer, and I just don't think either forward yet have been clinical enough in those big moments, and that's a big problem. And then it almost puts the pressure on the defence then to not be able to switch off for a moment. As you're saying, there's a few instances where they just haven't tracked a man, or we can count back to numerous sort of individual errors that have led to goals this season as well. And they're things that I think a manager can't really countenance for. They're just basics that you track your man, or footballers are human, they're going to make errors. You can't really countenance for that as a manager. But I've always been sort of looking at the underlying trends, thinking it'll turn and things will get better, because actually they're not performing badly if you look at those sort of underlying numbers. But then if you keep sort of shooting yourselves in the foot, you're never going to get the momentum, easy for me to say, the momentum to sort of kick on. They obviously won those 3 games in a row, and that showed how quickly you can rise up the table by doing that. But I just think the last 2 games in the Premier League, I'm doing like the pre-match video beforehand and going, they can go 5th for this win, they can go 4th for this win. And it's like, I think a few people commented actually in the video saying, how many times have you said the same thing before the game? And it's true. It's like, it always feels like it's a big opportunity, and they're just not grasping them. And I think Eddie Howe said at the start of the month that these opportunities are sort of running out, and it's right. And if you look at the fixtures they've got now coming up, it almost feels like they've missed 2 golden opportunities, because if they'd won last week and they'd won this week, 6 points on the board rather than 1, they're sitting in the top 4, and it almost gives you that cushion going into this brutal run of away games where they've got Liverpool next weekend, they've got Tottenham away coming up, they've got Man City coming away, and Newcastle are well within the rights to believe they can go to all 3 of those games and get something, and they are good enough to do that. But probability would suggest, and their away form this season would suggest, that that's not going to happen. And I think that's the frustration, because the 9th at the minute is sort of in touch and distance still of the top 4. But if they lose all 3 of those games, you can kiss goodbye to Champions League hopes, I think, and the European hopes then are hanging by a thread. I think obviously the sort of consolation to that is, because the English team have done so well in Europe again, it looks like it's going to be top 5 in the Champions League, and then obviously that filters down to an extra place in Europe. So unless someone unexpected wins the cup like Crystal Palace did last season, then top 8 gets Europe. So they're still going to be in a shout of Europe, but Champions League has to be the ambition at the start of the season. I think these next 3 games could make or break Newcastle's season domestically. And when you've got 3-game run, that could make or break your season. You don't want that 3-game run to be away games against top teams. And I know Brentford sort of sandwiches in there as a home game as well. But I mean, the way they're playing as well, that's no gimme at all. Obviously, Newcastle were well beaten at the G-Tech in November, and they could quite easily cut Newcastle and give them a hard game at St James's Park. And an interesting point on the home form as well is that, because the away form's been so bad, it almost puts pressure on them to get the big results in the home games. Now, it's almost like the fear factor at St James's Park is gone. I did a piece this morning, and if you look at they beat Man City, which is very much the outlier, but if you look at the other big games that they've had at home this season, Aston Villa, they got beat. Liverpool, they got beat. Arsenal, they got beat. Chelsea, they drew. Tottenham, they drew. Obviously, Villa was 2-0, but the other 4 games I mentioned there, they've dropped points with late goals as well. They've only taken 2 points from 15, whereas you look at those same 5 fixtures last season, they won 4 and drew 1 of them, so they took 13 out of 15. Now, that obviously then gives you a sort of much bigger cushion to go away from home, and because it's so hard to win away from home in the Premier League, it almost gives you that sort of freedom, I guess, to know that the home form's there. So the away forms are almost free hit. The away games are almost free hits, whereas this season, the away form's been so bad, it's almost put pressure on Newcastle to win those games, and they haven't done that against direct rivals, and I think that could be so costly at the end of the season, that the sort of 6-pointers, if you like, they haven't done enough to win them this season.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And, the home form's kind of allowed a kind of protection for the players. And I think the manager, because it has been so strong, I think that was the first defeat in 9 at home. And obviously, as you mentioned there, first defeat in 5 in the Premier League. So I suppose, look, they're the positives. As you mentioned, the table's so so tight. One win and you're straight back up to 5th or 6th. But obviously, if you don't pick up a victory in the next few games, then you could be as low down as 13, 14. So that puts an added extra element of pressure on just getting the right result. There's no time to kind of value a draw, because that might still see you outside of the top 10. That's how close it is. Just a reminder, ladies and gents, if you click the link in the podcast description box, you can get your discount offer on your NordVPN plan. Perfect if you're going away on an early holiday. If you want to catch up with all your UK TV shows, you can switch your location from wherever you are back to the UK, and you can watch the likes of the iPlayer and every other streaming service as well. One subscription can be used across 10 devices, no risk, with a 30-day money-back guarantee. I want to talk, Sean, about some individuals, and Anthony Gordon is one that I've got written down here. Obviously, he looked a little bit back to his best against PSV, and I think everyone was quite right, though, in terms of the team performance and individual performance. PSV are a good side. I think that was their first defeat in 15 away from home. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. You're only as good as the next result, next performance, so to speak. And Anthony Gordon, for me, on Sunday was really, really disappointing yet again. I think he had a few crosses, and most of them went straight out of play. There was one example which I think summed up his performance for me, was when it was a long ball down, and it's him up against a defender, and he's not gambled, and the defender messes up the header. And it's like, if he's gambled and he feels like he's going to get there, and he's in and around him, and he's straight onto goal. And that for me just summed it up. He didn't look confident, he didn't look happy, he didn't look comfortable. It just felt a little bit meh, and I suppose you can apply that to the overall performance as well. But Anthony Gordon, I mean, he's got to be running out of chances in the Premier League, doesn't he, Sean, to be starting? I know Anthony Langer's not done much, and obviously we haven't got the option of Jacob Murphy, but how many times can you start Anthony Gordon and just hope he's going to turn up? Because so far, in recent weeks, penalties aside, he's really disappointed me.
It's a frustrating one. It's an interesting one as well. I think I'm a fan of Anthony Gordon, but I get the sense that last year has made him probably the most polarising figure in Newcastle's squad. There's always sort of one player who divides opinion every season, and Gordon's just become that man this season. And I think that his dissenters would say that the numbers just aren't there. And you can't argue with that. I mean, the fact that he hasn't scored a goal from open play in the Premier League now for over a year is just ridiculous for a player of his ability and his standing. And he did an interview, was either earlier this month or maybe late last month, where he sort of, tried to say it wasn't quite as black and white as just a numbers game. But then knowing Anthony Gordon personality and some of the things that he said in previous interviews, I know that numbers are a big thing for him, and goals and assists are something he measures himself on. So the fact that they've completely dried up, certainly domestically, has to be a cause for concern. Now, I'll counter that in the sense that yesterday, I still feel like he's the only one of the four wingers who's just got that X factor in that game-changing moment in him, where when he's on it and when he sort of commits a man, he's still electrifying. He's still got that pace. He's still got that sort of, I don't know how to best describe it other than he's just a bit of a game changer. But then people then counter back going, that's all well and good, but he hasn't shown it, and that's perfectly fine. I think Harvey Barnes obviously is such a good finisher, and he's so good around the final third, but then sometimes the creativity maybe lacks with him. He doesn't necessarily beat men for fun the way that Gordon can. And again, when teams are in a low block, I think Barnes is sort of limited. I don't know if you would agree with that. Whereas if you give him the opportunities in the service, he's comfortably the best finisher at the club, and that's why he's the top goal scorer this season in all competitions. I think in terms of dropping Gordon, the problem you've got is obviously Jacob Murphy's injured, and Anthony Langer, as I touched on before, although he has sort of shown small shoots that he might be sort of getting his confidence up a bit, it's still nowhere near what you'd expect for a £55 million man. And the issue you've got is Gordon and Barnes are so far clear as Newcastle's two best wide options. is Anthony Langer starting ahead of Anthony Gordon going to make a positive difference? I would argue it doesn't. And that's the problem. I think if you've got a sort of fully functioning wide unit where all four players are playing well, then it's a no-brainer that if Anthony Gordon's not performing, not putting up the numbers, he gets taken out of the team. But I just don't see, or I don't think doing that right now necessarily benefits Newcastle in the way that it would do if you had a sort of, basically the competition was better. And I don't know if you would agree with that. I just don't think Alanga showed anything where you think he's the answer. And that's more the problem, I think, is if Gordon had someone breathing down his neck and he's putting in these performances, there'll be absolutely no debate and no argument and no sort of comeback that he should be taken out of the team. The problem is he hasn't got that coming through, and it's almost like, I don't know, a bit what I was saying before, that the eyes don't lie, and he still is the most dangerous option they've got. The frustration is he's not doing it enough. Now, the Champions League record is just so curious, isn't it? Because the fact that he's got 6 goals and he's now, in terms of the Champions League, proper joint top scorer in Newcastle's history in the competition, in a season where he has, or in a year where he hasn't scored any goals from open play. And I know a few of those have been penalties as well. It's just a bit of a weird one. Champions League wins shouldn't be sniffed at, but it's probably going to be something controversial I say now. But I feel like this season, the Champions League, compared to 2 years ago, you're almost seeing now the difference in quality in the Premier League and how much the quality from 1 to 20 in the Premier League has come up massively with the money involved. And again, if any listener disagrees with this, then feel free to put it in the comments. But if you look at Newcastle's games at home this season, and there might be an obvious one I'm forgetting here, but certainly in the Premier League, I can't remember a game Newcastle won comfortably in the Premier League. They've won quite a few games in the Premier League, but every game's felt like a battle. Even games where they've won like 2-0 against Crystal Palace or 2-0 against Nottingham Forest, you've been waiting for the breakthrough moment, and it's almost been hairy until that moment comes. And obviously Leeds, who are 5th bottom, they've won 4-3. Burnley, who are 2nd bottom, 2-1, and Burnley almost got an equaliser right at the death. Wolves, rock bottom, 1-0. But actually the 3 games in the Champions League, and they have played really well in those games, but I do think that there's probably an argument where Athletic Bilbao, Benfica, and PSV, are they of the quality of like a Fulham or someone like that? And now that sounds ridiculous saying out loud, but actually I do think it sort of proves how hard the Premier League is now to be consistent, and that is why it's sort of such a congested table, because everybody beats everybody, whereas actually in Europe, the English clubs have got such a superiority over the other clubs, unless it's like the big ones like Bayern Munich, Real Madrid, Barcelona, those PSG, those sort of ilk. I think that's shown this season, and that's why maybe Anthony Gordon's getting the success. I mean, PSV were unbeaten away from home in all competitions since March. Newcastle won that game with absolute ease, and I don't actually think they played anywhere near the best we've seen on Eddie Howe, but they were so comfortable in that game. They were so comfortable against Athletic Bilbao. They were so comfortable against Benfica, and I think that's probably like the sort of the elephant in the room there, that the Champions League phase almost exposed that Newcastle, in terms of the Champions League teams, probably are in that sort of top 12 teams in the competition because of the quality of the Premier League. Whereas actually the Premier League's been so much more difficult to have a comfortable win. I don't know if you would agree with that, Andrew, but certainly from my memory, I can't remember a game at home, certainly, where it's been comfortable, whereas the 3 Champions League wins at home have all been so comfortable. It's almost been bizarre how comfortable it's been. Now, obviously, that will change as the competition progresses and the games get harder and so on and so forth. But I do think that sort of explains the Anthony Gordon sort of anomaly, really, that he has been so good in the Champions League and his record is so much better than it is in the Premier League.
Yeah, let us know your thoughts in the comments on that. I agree. I think the game that I felt most comfortable in was probably the Man City victory. I thought Eddie Howe did an absolute number on Pep Guardiola, and they deserved it. But it wasn't like I was sitting there with a deck chair up. You know, it was still a little bit nervy. But yeah, you're right in terms of the quality and what have you. And obviously, it is the Champions League, and I think that competition, that the kind of the reputation of it will maybe boost a player like Anthony Gordon potentially. All eyes on him under the lights, and also teams tend to play the way Newcastle United like as well. Yeah. Whereas in the Premier League, I think Maybe teams are a little bit more thorough in their preparation and they adapt a little bit better, and they've frustrated Newcastle United totally. I don't know about you, but on Sunday against Villa, Sean, one thing that I noticed was that, especially in the second half, you had, whether it be Kieran Trippier or Lewis Hall, or you had the wingers going into the space down the flanks, and you had the ball at the feet of Botman and Chow, but they seemed to be a little bit hesitant to do that kind of long ball that Fabian Schär's famed for, that Bruno sometimes will do. And that kind of impacted the flow slightly. Now, there were 7 accurate long balls between the two of them, and I haven't compared that to other games, but it rolls into the point, I think, maybe about belief and how Newcastle are very static at the moment. It's not necessarily about the long ball, but about just the player making the right runs. And when you've got those two elements in your play, it is very difficult to come out of a 90-minute game, I guess, with 3 points.
Yeah, and I think it probably sort of speaks to the difference in profile of player of Fabian Schär to Malik Chow. Malik Chow's been brilliant for Newcastle, but I don't think Malik Chow's a player who's going to spray a 45-yard crossfield ball on an absolute pinhead for Anthony Gordon the way that Fabian Schär can. And that's just nothing against Chow's abilities. Just Schär's always had that sort of passing ability in his lockout. It does unlock a different part of Newcastle's game. It probably speaks to the wider point of what we were saying before, that it does feel a bit stale and a bit programmatic and robotic in the way that Newcastle sort of try and break teams down. I think you lose count in a game sometimes where, just say yesterday, for example, where Trippier, Miley, because he's the right side of centre midfielder, and Harvey Barnes sort of play the triangles and try and break in that way. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But I feel when you've got a team in a low block, it's very hard to sort of, manipulate the amount of positions to do that. It works much better when you've got a team who's stretched and who sort of take the game. Yeah, and as you said there, PSV just played in Newcastle's hands the other night by doing that, trying to play with the ball and dominate the ball. And that's music in Newcastle's ears. And Premier League teams just been a bit more savvy to that. And I think that the long ball sort of lends itself to a game that's stretched as well, because the long ball works when you can release someone quickly over the top. And when a game's sort of compact and a team's sitting in, the opportunity to do that's much more limited. So that's probably why the numbers were so low yesterday. And the fact that I just don't think Chow and Botman have the same sort of ability to do that in the locker than Fabian Schär has. And yeah, it was just, I just felt like it was all a bit samey and all a bit sort of trying to build it up patiently. And that sort of lends itself to the way that the game panned out, I think. And I think it just sort of played in the Villa's hands. They were happy to just sort of sit in and absorb that all day, the same way that Wolves were last week, and the same way that, just plucking another away day example over the top of my head, Man United on Boxing Day was exactly the same sort of thing, where for 45 minutes Newcastle absolutely dominated the game, dominated possession, but struggled to break a team down. And yeah, it's an issue that we've already touched upon numerous times in this podcast alone, but it's something that they're going to have to work on and change. And I think that's only going to come with more training time and with more creative additions, really, to sort of to tweak it. And I think there'll be a lot more of this sort of frustration between now and the end of the season as they sort of evolve and get rid of these teething issues that they've had so far.
I asked viewers and listeners to get in touch and to give me their key verdict from the defeat to Aston Villa. So thank you to everyone who's got in touch. We've got Henry saying, previously good players looking a shadow of themselves and a manager who can't adapt and has zero tactical awareness in his opinion. Ryan says, we're so easy to play against. How makes like subs that haven't worked before. He wants to see them try something different when Newcastle are getting beat. Graham says we play far too deep and it's essentially a 4-5-1 now instead of a 4-3-3. A front three aren't technical enough, as in they can't dribble or receive the ball in tight spaces. Might seem wild, but I'd play a 4-2-4 with Asula, Wissa, Voldemort and Barnes, Tonali and Miley sitting, which is quite the suggestion. Would you do that, Sean?
I think that's extreme, certainly from the start, but I think there's no issue with trying that in a game that they're chasing, for example, sort of try and overload the attacking areas. A few interesting points there, I think. I think to say how has no tactical awareness is very harsh for a manager who's proven himself to be one of the very best in the Premier League. But I take the point that we're seeing very little change and very little impact from the bench. It was interesting because in one of the recent post-match press conferences, I think it was Wolves away, the question was asked of Howe about the like-for-like replacements, and he sort of took issue with it in the fact that it's like-for-like that you're bringing on winger for winger, forward for forward, but he feels that they've got very different profiles, so it's not a like-for-like change, and while you're not tweaking the system, the hope is the impact they have will be very different to the player that they've replaced, which I kind of get, but until you see that sort of tangible evidence that that's working, then those sort of accusations are going to keep coming your way. I think what's interesting to me, if you think back to when Newcastle had Alexander Isak and Callum Wilson as their two forward options, there was always this sort of debate and clamour from a certain section of the fans to see them together. Now, he never did it from the start, or if he did, it was very rare he did it from the start, but he was never afraid to do it mid-game. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but certainly from a bench situation, I don't remember him, since Johan Vissa's been fit, throwing on Johan Vissa and Nick Voltemade at the same time. It's almost like he's reluctant to do it. Now, the caveat to that might be the fact that because the schedule's so heavy, or there are minute restrictions where it's sort of there have to be a like-for-like change. Now, Will Asula coming back could see that happen a bit more. Whereas, for example, yesterday, if Will Asula was a bit sort of fitter and a bit more ahead in terms of his recovery, yes, Nick Voltemade comes off of Johan Vissa, but does then Will Asula come on for a midfielder, or does Will Asula come for a winger? And you sort of see that too up front from the bench. And I think that's going to be a real test, I think, of the theory that he's reluctant to do that, and he's reluctant to change things, certainly in terms of the system he plays, because the evidence from the past was when Isak and Wilson were at the club was that he isn't reticent to do that. But then this season, he definitely has been. And I think the fact that they've got three forwards fit now's going to be that's a test of whether he is actually reticent to do that and whether he is stubborn to sort of change the game. Because if you've got two strikers on the bench, the opportunity to do that obviously is a lot more than it is one striker on the bench. And yeah, it's an interesting one. He's not going to change his system from the start, but I do think there's opportunity to do so from the bench. And I think in the next few weeks, you're going to see whether he is actually willing to do that and open to do that. And the answers we're going to get are going to be very interesting to see whether A, he does it, and B, if it works.
Yep, we'll wait and see. We've got Miserable Mike saying players ball watching on the second goal and not tracking runners. I promise you, I didn't write that under that name.
Miserable Mike's a great
name. Chris saying we may remain inconsistent in the final third. Doug says, why can we not push forward as a straight attacking unit? We're so disjointed. Tim says, as expected, nothing new. Same title tactics, same one-dimensional play. Jack says, we're too predictable, as does Ben. Leave your comments with us and we'll get back to you. Final question then, Sean, before we do sign off. Eddie Howe, of course, is constantly asked about the transfer window. It is January after all. And his quote yesterday's got a few people talking. We have the players that we have. We have to find the solutions with those players. There's no point in me thinking we need another type of player now at this moment, because it's not going to happen. The next chance we will have to change the squad really will be the summer. Is that Eddie Howe shutting up shop and saying no incomings? Is that Eddie Howe being a bit cute and not showing his hand? Is it something in between?
I would say it's something in between, but sort of leading towards the second of those options. Now, he was asked after the Wolves game, after that like-for-like question, whether or not Newcastle would want to bring in a creative midfielder or another forward to sort of give them that extra bit of impetus in the attacking areas. His response that day was that Newcastle don't have the means financially to do that in the January transfer window, and anything like that will wait till the summer. The response to that question yesterday, just for a bit of context, was to a question along the similar lines in terms of, do you need to bring in someone sort of different who can change things? And that's why he's saying there, in terms of bringing in a player who can change things and who's going to be different to the squad that we have. That's not going to happen till the summer. It was sort of an extension of that answer from Wolves last week. That, to me, I took that as he's not ruling out signing this window, and certainly in terms of trying to get more defensive numbers in the building this month, he's never ruled that out publicly, and I still don't think he has. I don't think that's him ruling that out publicly. I think realistically, this window was always going to be, if they do sign someone, it's going to be someone who bolsters the numbers defensively, and I still think that is the case and could be the case. Now, obviously, they've only got 1 week of the window to do that, and Dan Burn coming back into the fold certainly sort of changes the mindset, I think, towards the fact that he's back in the squad. The two areas of concern, obviously, is a right-sided centre half, because Fabian Schär's out for at least a few months, and then you've obviously got no left back cover really for Lewis Hall. Now, if you look at the two players who've covered for Lewis Hall this season, it's been Tino Livramento, who of course is out injured right now for a few weeks, and it's been Dan Burn. I don't think Newcastle fans have too short memories to remember how much of frustration it was to have a centre-back who was Newcastle's player of the season last season playing as a left-back, and he did so admirably, but obviously if you've seen the impact of Lewis Hall since he's come back into the team, the difference is stark. Having an actual left-back playing there who's natural at the position and who hasn't just been shoehorned in there, and it was admirable that Dan Burn did that with no complaint, and I think did the best he could in that position. I also think if you then look at the sort of trend of Newcastle performances during that time of the season, it's almost negligible not to bring in another defensive body. Now, whether that is a left-back who can cover for Hall, whether that is another centre-back option remains to be seen. Personally, I would like to see them do both, but I don't think they will. I think we one or the other. And I think that's where we're at. If you look at the last week of this window, if they bring in any incomings, it's going to be a defender, and I think it's going to be a defender with a young profile who doesn't break the bank, and it'll be a defender who they've scouted extensively over the last few months, who they probably would have tried to make a play for in the summer as well. When we met Ross Wilson last month, he told us then that Newcastle's have the means to spend in the January transfer market, but anything they do has to be with the summer in mind, and they can't limit what they can do in the summer. So I took that as two things. They can't overspend, because that will affect how much money they can spend in the summer, and it'll also have to be someone they bring in the building who they were going to look at in the summer anyway. And I think if Newcastle fans are looking for any hope that they'll bring someone in, that's what I can offer you. I don't think Eddie Howe's closed the door on transfers completely. You'll get asked about it tomorrow before the PSG game, where you might do that, but I still think with a week left of the window, Newcastle will still be looking for defensive recruits in that mold that I've mentioned there already.
Well, fingers crossed they can get someone through the door. Any sort of sign, I think, would be a massive boost going into the remainder of the season. Big thanks to Sean for stepping into the shoes of Mark, who unfortunately is ill. I'm going to be catching up with John Gibson in the next few hours to talk about that trip to PSG in the Champions League. Sam as well will be back to help look at that game later in the week, and of course then we'll look ahead to the Premier League next weekend. Thanks to you guys for watching and listening. Do get in the comments, do get involved. We always love to read what your thoughts on anything that we've discussed today. Again, thank you very much for watching, and we'll catch you guys very soon.